Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Annabelle Krause, and I'm a sophomore studying history and literature and classics at the college, and I'm a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the park side and the JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. Please take your seats now and join me in welcoming Kendall Carl and Swathi Kella.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. We're so glad to welcome you all, whether you're here in person or whether you're tuning in virtually. My name is Swathi, and I'm a senior in Foho House studying social studies and Spanish. This year, I'm serving as the president of the Harvard Political Review.
And I'm Kendall. I'm a first year staying in Weld. I study government and international relations with a secondary in economics. Here at the college, I write for some on-campus publications, I do debate, and I work here at the Forum. Tonight, we are honored to be welcomed by Jonathan Martin and Alex Burns to talk about their new book, New York Times bestseller, This Will Not Pass, Trump, Biden, and the Battle for America's Future.
Yes, so we're excited to welcome Alex Burns. Alex is Politico's newest columnist and also the editor for Global Affairs. Prior to rejoining Politico, he worked at the New York Times, covering federal politics and power at the highest levels. He graduated from Harvard College in 2008, where he served as the president of the Harvard Political Review.
Right. And Jonathan Martin is currently serving as a senior political correspondent for the New York Times. He's also a political analyst at CNN, and prior to writing This Will Not Pass, was the co-author of The End of the Line, Obama versus Romney. Before he joined the Times, he was a senior political reporter for Politico, so we're so thankful to have both of you guys here tonight, and we'll dive right in. I think one of the core topics of the book is this sort of new wave that's entered the Republican Party, this Trumpism idea. And the secondary concept has been the pushback that certain members of the GOP have started to initiate. The book talks about Governor Larry Hogan, who's actually here at the Forum last week, and Liz Cheney, who's coming next week, who have pushed back against the Trumpism that's run rampant within the GOP. So I'm curious, what's y'all's take on the future of the Republican Party? Is it the case that moderates are going to be able to reel in the Marjorie Taylor Greens? Will we keep pushing further and further right? Is there a chance that we have a true splintering and they become two separate entities? What is y'all's take?
Well, thank you for the question. Thank you all for being here, and to the IOP for hosting us. This is, as Swathi said, I'm a very, very proud IOP alum and HPR alum in particular, and in so many ways this book would not exist without the support of the IOP, in part because of our two phenomenal researchers, Luke and Christine, who are right over there, who are just absolutely extraordinary partners on the project. To answer your question, I think that one of the things that Jonathan and I saw as a big framing question for the book was, what will be the future of the Republican Party post-Trump? We were asking that question in the fall of 2020 when we decided to write this book, and we're sitting here today and asking ourselves, when will the Republican Party even get to post-Trump? So in so many ways, we have moved less than I think the country has moved less, the party has moved less than I think either of us might have expected when we started this project two and some years ago. To me, the biggest question going forward, sort of more in a more tactile way, is there anybody in the Republican Party who can give the base what it wants, but isn't Donald Trump? I think there's a very, very limited appetite for an anti-Trump candidate in the Republican Party, and I think person after person who has stepped forward to sort of lead the cavalry charge against Donald Trump and the forces of Trumpism has just gotten mowed down, because like Republican voters, if you force them to choose between being pro-Trump and anti-Trump, nobody's that interested in choosing. Very, very few people are interested in being anti-Trump. But I think you do see substantial interest now among voters, certainly among office holders, in a sort of post-Trump candidate, somebody who can sort of push a lot of the buttons that Trump pushes for the party, can speak to the, in some cases, legitimate, in some cases, pretty ugly grievances of the Republican base, without sort of being Donald Trump and being this strong man who's contemptuous of sort of the core of the American political system. I think that's a question that's going to get answered to some degree in the presidential primaries, but not before then.
Well, thanks for having us, and let me just say it's a treat to be here at Harvard, especially to be here with Alex, who I know has a lot of fond memories of this stage and of this building and this campus. So this is fun. I guess I would just say the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, for that matter, are not an array of insiders who are in smoke-filled rooms plotting about the future of the party and trying to figure out how to create the best possible product with ruthless pragmatism in mind. The Republican Party and the Democratic Party are the voters who participate in their elections, and whether it's primaries or the generals, that's who the party is, and that gets to the core of the challenge here. That look, if tomorrow people like Kevin McCarthy, we'll talk more about him later, the House Minority Leader, Luke and Christina are very fond of Kevin McCarthy. If Kevin McCarthy tomorrow thought that the voters in the Republican Party no longer had any regard for Donald Trump, well, he would say, Donald who? I don't recall the name. Who is that again? He'd happily move on, right? But that's not where the voters are. And so it's not like there's a mechanism where the insiders, the donors, the lawmakers, the lobbyists, the strategists who comprise the party can like snap a finger and change the party. If they could, they would have done that years ago. And the fact is they can't. And so they adapt or they leave the party. That's the choice, right? And so I think the future of the party is going to be some version of what comes after Trump, but it's not going to be a rejection of it. It'll be more of an extension of it than anything else. That's what happens to political parties, and they don't change overnight. They take on the character of whatever they are, and yes, it mutates over time, but it doesn't change immediately.
On the subject of change or lack of it, Mr. Burns, in 2007, when you were president of the Harvard Political Review, you led the publication of a magazine that was
Here's
called...
the Oppo, folks. Christina and Luke played this one, I think.
You led the publication of a magazine called The Age of the Mayor. And in it, you wrote that mayors presented a source of optimism for our country. And if anything, that's been tested this past year with the COVID-19 pandemic and a number of local issues. In your book, you talk about the ways in which mayors engage with the federal government, often pushing back or asking for additional funding when it comes to political issues. I'm curious about if you've seen a transition in the way that local and federal governments interact with each other over the course of these past few decades.
So you've made my day with this question. I was very, very proud of that issue of the HPR, and actually used to have the cover framed on my desk. And I don't know where it is now for some reason. But look, I think that the core observation there that there's a level of innovation in policy and accountability in politics at the city level that doesn't exist at other levels of the American system is as true or truer today than it was an alarmingly long time ago when that issue came out. And I think that you saw that in, did I just get extremely loud? No, okay. I think you saw that during COVID, right? When you had this hapless or clueless response at so many levels of the federal government, and the people who actually needed to make life and death decisions were mayors and governors and county executives, depending on which municipality you're living in. I think that the thing that's exciting about it is that there's sort of more room for innovation today than there's been in a really long time, because there's this massive flood of money into state and local governments as a result of the American Rescue Plan, where you suddenly have, I did a story earlier this year from Richmond, Virginia, where the mayor is building this network of community centers that rival or are aspirationally will rival sort of the great public infrastructure of sort of Western and Northern European countries that we think of as so developed in that way. He's not doing his own tax base. He's doing it with money from the mayor of Boston is doing this transit that is paid for heavily with federal money. So there is a level, again, of experimentation that has the possibility of setting the agenda for the country in a larger way if those ideas kind of bubble up from the bottom. The thing that's maybe less reassuring about it is that people have been more and more looking to their local government and local leaders to sort of make those life and death decisions or do those bold policy experiments, because so much of the rest of the system has broken down or is frozen or is just simply not getting stuff done. Like, it would be better than an experiment with free mass transit on a couple lines in Boston is like a large-scale experiment with free mass transit of a kind that they've done in Germany, right? We don't do that kind of thing in this country, and it's sort of the beauty and the failure of the system that we don't have the capacity to sort of make change on that scale in the same way anymore. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
I'll blow it up a lot, go from the local, really impactful level to how America's struggling democracy at home complicates some of our more global efforts. The Biden administration has come in and framed their view of the world as being this battle between autocracy and democracy. But a lot of countries have made the point that it's not exactly clear where the United States falls on that line right now. And so how does the existence of a struggling democracy at home complicate the United States' efforts to engage in sort of global challenges and lead this coalition of democracies that the Biden administration talks about? And what can the administration do to project credibility when we lack it?
Yeah, well, we have a scene in the book where then Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany is meeting with Vice President Harris and expressing some skepticism that America is in fact back. That was the Biden message from day one of his election, and then obviously his administration is, America is back, which is basically telling the rest of the world, like, yeah, that Trump deal, that was an anomaly. We're a stable country. You can trust the currency here, and we're going to be there for our allies and keep up with our alliances abroad. It's not totally clear, like the international community believes that, and there's still profound concern about whether or not America is going to be there, whether or not Trumpism is really dead and in the grave. I was just in Asia in 2 different countries, and that was the constant conversation was, what's the deal with Trump? Is he running again? Is he coming back? And the subtext of that is, can we still trust America? Or are you guys going to go back to this sort of right-wing nationalism that took hold there? And I think that's still uncertain. And I think it obviously creates a challenge for Biden the closer he gets to 24, as Biden tries to juggle diplomacy, between China and Taiwan, and between Russia, Ukraine, and the rest of the continent. And are you still going to be around? Are you going to run for re-election? Are you going to win? And the louder those questions get at home, the more they reverberate abroad as Biden tries to play peacemaker.
And I think we've had these situations in the past before where countries or administrations have made big swings president to president, but there's always been some sort of through line. Do you think that's like fundamentally different now that states like Iran, when they're trying to negotiate a new JCPOA, want it ratified by the Senate as a treaty because they don't trust executive orders anymore? Is this a new brand of distrust?
I don't think it's entirely new, but I think the breakdown of certain stable through lines, particularly in American security policy, and I think I think Iran is a good example. I think that you talk to people around the world who work in American diplomacy, and the reality of the Obama administration spending years negotiating TPP, and then not just Donald Trump turning against it, but the standard bearers in Obama's own party rejecting it, and an incumbent president just totally failing to get that level of policy enacted and seeing it just collapse, I think people appropriately walked away from that with a great deal of skepticism. The thing that I worry about, frankly, like not just as a reporter, but as a citizen, right, is that when you have the level of breakdown in when the sort of center ground in American politics shrinks to the extent that it has, and when there's such a sort of rejection of whatever is perceived as the status quo, not just on the far right, but across the spectrum, you do potentially put the country in a place where you just have wild swings in policy that make it incredibly difficult for regular people to plan their lives, right? So the fact that your rights as an immigrant or as a person who is married to a person of the same gender, or as a person whose health care is structured in a certain way could look wildly different from administration to administration, that actually is different than 15 or 20 or 30 years ago. So you see the swing most in its most pronounced way in foreign policy, because the president is kind of an emperor when it comes to foreign policy. And if Donald Trump were a more serious person about government and more educated about the way the presidency works, he could have done a whole lot more to make some pretty abrupt changes in American security policy. But it's not just security policy. If you were to, and this is one of the things that the Joe Manchins of the Kirsten Sinemas of the world get all kinds of grief for saying, that if you get rid of the filibuster in the Senate in order to pass an abortion rights law today, well, guess what? The filibuster is not going to be there to protect you when the next guys ban all abortions from conception 3 or 4 years from now. And I think it's hard, when you look at the trend lines in American politics, not to suspect that that's the kind of sort of wild turbulence that we might be in for.
I can't believe Alex just mentioned Kirsten Sinema. There was no boos from the audience there. It's just, Kirsten Sinema is starting to catch on a little bit here, folks. This is going to be interesting.
Yeah, and as we think about swings in our electoral politics and in the government, we're currently faced with the upcoming 2022 midterm elections. Now, in your book, you talk a lot about Georgia in the 2020 elections, the special elections for the 2 Senate positions that were up. And also the election of Donald Trump. And one of the things that you were talking about is how Donald Trump focused so much on the election and the idea of trying to overturn the election that he ended up turning away voters, while Democrats turned out Asian American voters and Black American voters in historic rates. Now, tomorrow, Reverend Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker will be taking the stage for their debate. What issues do you think will be front and center at this debate tomorrow? And do you think that the shadow of Donald Trump's attempts to overturn the election are still going to be cast?
Well, I know the issues that'll be on the minds of most folks watching that debate tomorrow. I don't know if it'll actually be raised by the moderators themselves, or to say nothing of Senator Warnock, but obviously the scandal that has engulfed Walker's campaign is going to be front and center, and I would expect that Walker will have a prefabricated answer that he'll deliver about his life's journey and where he's fallen short and found redemption through grace. There'll be a little bit of Baptist cooking down there, I'm sure, tomorrow night. I don't think he'll get into specifics about his various, well, I'll leave it there. But I think he'll address it. The larger issue, though, yeah, I think it's going to be what you've seen in the campaigns around the country. The Republican, Herschel Walker, will try to focus on linking Warnock to Biden, an unpopular president, and will try to link him to inflation and the cost of living, which obviously we heard again today is pretty severe. And I think Warnock will try to present himself as someone who's been a pragmatic and effective leader for Georgia. Which, again, is typically what Democrats do when they're running in either purple or red states, try to sort of cast themselves as separate from the national party. Of course, Trumpism looms over that campaign. It looms over every campaign. Look, traditionally, the reason that the party out of power does well in midterm elections is because they're able to prosecute a referendum-style campaign on the party that does have power. And what they stand for, they being the opposition party, doesn't usually matter that much because the public is focused on the government today and who's in power. That's been complicated this time around because the shadow of Trump looms so large that it's not a pure referendum, because voters are still thinking about the last guy in office who wants to run again. And so when the average voter is, well, you know, I don't love Joe Biden. Like, Jesus, I'm paying $5 for a gallon of gas. You know, what was the Obama line? Have you seen the price of kale? But they also think, but geez, if I vote for the Republicans, am I buying into the Donald Trump party again? That's a lot of baggage. And, you know, when the Republicans have nominated candidates who remind them of Donald Trump, it doesn't help. So that, to me, is the big story of this midterm, is how the traditional sort of construct of running against the party in power has been disrupted largely by the enduring power of Trumpism.
One of my favorite passages in the book, Jonathan wrote this section at the end of the chapter on the Georgia runoffs. It's just this really, really beautiful consideration of sort of the duality of Georgia as a place in American politics and a place in American culture, and a place that's been, you know, home to you know, communities of unique diversity and played a decisive role in the civil rights movement, and also you know, gave rise to some of the ugliest chapters in our modern and not so modern history. And I think one of the things that's so notable about this campaign is the fact that it's even a close fight at this point, and it really reflects the transformation of that state. That, you know, in the book, in the passage that I'm talking about, it's a sort of a snapshot of this tipping point moment in the state, right? Not where it's gone from being a red state to being a blue state, but where the more diverse and more cosmopolitan and sort of tolerant forces in Georgia politics just barely overcame the forces arrayed behind Donald Trump. And as Jonathan says, in a normal midterm wave election, things would almost certainly flip back in the other direction. But you know, Herschel Walker is an extraordinarily bad candidate, and you know, even beyond the national forces in the Republican Party. That, you know, I think 10 or 15 years ago, you put Herschel Walker on the ballot in Georgia, and he would win easily, just because it's a Republican state, and that's just not where it is anymore.
I mean, the two of us right now are currently making some career changes, so we don't have the capacity to write this story, but if we did, it's a good story to write, and that is the Walker candidacy really reflects a larger story about today's Republican Party. They want to paper over a lot of their challenges, their structural challenges, and he was kind of the get-rich-quick candidate. You know, he was the lose 30 pounds in a week candidate. And not only has it not worked, it's, in fact, rather than papering over their challenges, it's exposed their challenges, and it's exposed their sort of scheme, if you will, to get around the hard work on a lot of levels. You know, karma can be a challenge.
We talk about Georgia as a tipping state, and I'm from Texas, so I can sort of see maybe there are some more states.
You haven't tipped yet there. It's
a
long time.
It's a good question. It's a question. Are there existence of other states that are trending here? Is this possible, or are we a long time from Texas?
Other states that are tipping? Mm. Yeah, I mean, the Texas tip kind of got tipped back over the other side, because while you picked up a lot of strength in the suburbs and the big cities, you lost considerable strength in the Rio Grande Valley because of the realignment of Hispanic voters there, which obviously is one of the huge stories in American politics today, is what's happened in South Texas. So I think the Texas transition has been slowed, if not reversed. You know, I think we sort of saw this in Arizona and Georgia in the last election. It's sort of not a huge surprise. I'm a little interested in what's happening in Utah right now. Like Mike Lee, who was very much a sort of non-Trump Republican, you know, Mormon conservative who totally acquiesced to Trumpism, is now running in a state that never really liked Donald Trump that much. They're Republicans, but they're not Trumpists. It's a more complicated place because of the LDS Church. And look, Lee is still the favorite to win, but he's running against this fella, Evan McMullen, who is a third-party candidate, but who got the Democratic Party in Utah to stand down and effectively bless his candidacy. Now, it's a Utah, so I'm not sure between Democrats and independents that still gets you more than 45% of the vote. But it's interesting enough that some of you all may have seen this. Mike Lee was on Fox News last night, and he looked at the camera, and as our former president would say, he begged like a dog for Mitt Romney to endorse him because, speaking of sons of the Commonwealth, Mitt Romney has not yet endorsed his fellow senator from Utah. And Lee said, I need your support, need your family's support. It was a pretty extraordinary moment that you typically wouldn't see from a Utah senator less than a month before the election.
I guess one of the themes we've talked about throughout, and it's a pretty impossible question to answer, that the book can have certain harrowing excerpts where it's not entirely clear that we're out of the shadow yet, that Trump continues to have influence, primarying dissidents within the party, floating the idea of 2024, and lending support to certain far-right candidates. And so, are we in a post-Trump era? When do we get back to normal? Or is this the new normal? Are we reverberating until some big shock event?
Well, I think we're certainly not in a post-Trump era as far as we can tell right now. If he runs again, then, as he would say, we'll see what happens. But I think there are a lot of reasons to believe that he individually is on the decline politically. Obviously, a majority of the country dislikes him. A majority of the country dislikes him very strongly. When you look at, there was a poll out in Wisconsin yesterday that, I'm going to get these numbers slightly wrong, but where Biden's approval rating was like 40% or something, but Trump's unfavorability rating was like way up in the 50s, like closer to 60 than 50. That's how you end up losing a winnable election, is by nominating somebody who is just like that toxic with a majority of the country. Even within the Republican Party, the interest that you see in figures like Ron DeSantis, again, it's not a rejection of sort of Trump's ideological profile or even stylistic profile, but it is sort of an indication that, like, can we kind of get on to the next thing now? If Trump somehow doesn't run, for whatever reason doesn't run in 24, then I think 10 years from now, 5 years from now, we'll look back on this period as kind of the, where we haven't quite called the time of death yet, right? My own expectation is that he probably will run again, whether or not he's indicted, whether or not he wins the nomination, like, we'll see. I do think there's a decent story to tell, and I do think we tell it in the book about the political resiliency of the country, right? That, like, one way to look at this experience that we've had the last couple of years is this a harrowing test of the system, and it's hard to look at the Capitol being stormed and a sitting president threatening not to leave office and say, things are actually going okay. But another way to look at it is that those things happened, and then he did leave office, and then the next president came in, and he has had actually a very productive first few years. And when we were wrapping up this book, our final deadline was February of this year. That was when it was like, pencils down, it's over. And I had sort of written a line in the epilogue about how the prospects for bipartisan cooperation seemed really dim, and Jonathan said, let's take that out, because, like, you just never know. And boy, was he right, because since then you've had the CHIPS bill, you have, I guess the text was something like, beyond the infrastructure legislation. Seems like not much else is going to happen. You had the CHIPS bill, you had the gun bill. For all we know, in the lame duck session, they're going to, they could very well create a non-Supreme Court, like a legislative guarantee of the right to same-sex marriage on a bipartisan basis. Like, that's pretty good, for a country that's supposedly being torn apart at the seams. And I'm not generally a glass half full kind of guy, and I think that over the last few years, if you were to take the pessimistic bet on American politics, you would usually be right. But I don't know. I think there's also a lot of sort of downbeat analysis of this moment and doomsaying about this moment that could look a little bit myopic down the line, depending on how sort of the next couple scenes of this go.
I think future historians could be very confused by the last 2 years because you've had, as Alex said, you've had a near insurrection in the U.S. Capitol, and extreme partisanship and division, but yet you had this sort of renaissance here of sorts of lawmaking. And it gets to what I think is going to be one of the most fascinating storylines next year. I know we're talking about the midterms today, but if I could just hop to 23, I think we're really going to see the massive gap between the House GOP and the Senate GOP on display next year in ways that have been sort of obscured because Democrats had the House majority. But I think you'll see it next year. Kevin McCarthy calls it a truck stop versus a country club. And I think you'll really see that come to fruition next year. As Senator Cowan knows here, who joined us tonight, the Senate Republican Conference is still reflective of a pre-Trump era. You've got lawmakers who are plenty conservative, but they're just not Trumpist. They want to make laws. The reason I think you saw a lot of this work get done the last 2 years is because you had a pent-up feeling in the Senate in both parties of, why am I here? To name post offices and go on Codels occasionally? Well, some of them are, but no, like people like John Cornyn or Todd Young from Texas and from Indiana, like they're in Washington to make laws and to do deals and to try to help people. And that's what they wanted to do. And I think once they had an opportunity to do that, even on a scale that Democrats would have preferred, wasn't quite what they, would have, you wanted, God, they jumped at it. They jumped at it. I think if you had told the smart sort of center-left crowd, I won't mention any names here, though I'm awfully tempted, that there would be bipartisan cooperation in the Senate on a range of bills that was blessed in part by Mitch McConnell, they would have said, you're so naive, man. You don't understand. They don't want to do anything. They're all obstructionists. And it's just more complicated than that, And one of the things that we're most proud of in the book is, there's so many books out there about this period, about Trump, and they're important. And Lord knows we have plenty of Trump in that book. He's even on the title. But it's bigger than just a book about Trump. It's bigger than a book about the presidency. There's a lot in there on Congress. And we get really deep into the characters of Congress. And I think that's valuable in this moment because it explains precisely what I'm just talking about. Why in this moment of great division and rancor, there was this incredible renaissance of lawmaking.
Do you think Americans broadly are recognizing of that renaissance? Like you said, a lot of the media is so...
Hell no.
Yeah. No, and I think one reason for real pessimism, as if you needed one more, is that, I think that everybody from the far left to the center left to the center and the center right has had this sense that, if we could just get some stuff done, the American people would reward us for that in one way or another. And I think there's not a whole lot of evidence that that's likely to happen in this election. The mantra from the Biden folks early on was shots and checks, right? Is that, get those vaccines out, get those stimulus checks out. And the stimulus checks turned out to have like a little fine print at the bottom about inflation. And the vaccines obviously didn't get quite as far as they thought they would, but it is this, I think, frustrating irony of the way American politics works right now. That, if you ask people, the old days of are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Are you better off now than you were 2 years ago? Almost universally, the answer is yes, right? And it doesn't really look like voters are about to go rush to the polls and reward the ruling party or their partners on the other side for that. Just the last twist on that is that, on the Republican side, I do think there's evidence that people who, one of the big questions on the Republican side is, if I do anything with Democrats, is it going to be the end of my career? And so far, the answer to that is, not quite yet. We'll see how it pans out when some of these deal makers ultimately run for re-election, because a lot of them were free to make deals because they weren't.
And as we move forward into this era of greater bipartisanship, how do you think it will affect the relation of Republican lawmakers who, for instance, like in Kevin McCarthy's case, have so far swung the entire pedestal on their relations with Trump? This is someone who, as you report in your book, initially recognized all of Trump's wrongdoing in the January 6th insurrection, but then completely swung the other way. Do you think they're just going to try to position themselves away from the issue and forget about it? Do you think there's still space for ongoing accountability in the years to come?
Well, I think that just when you say that new era of bipartisanship, I think there's a question: is are we in a new era of bipartisanship, or did we have this sort of brief moment of bipartisanship? And that's to be determined. Look, I think the thing that's tough for Kevin, when you talk about Kevin McCarthy, part of the reason people can make deals is because they have their starting principles, their political goals, and their substantive goals, and then they try to reconcile those with what folks on the other side of the table have in their starting principles and their political goals. I don't think it's clear that Kevin McCarthy has a starting set of political principles or any particular set of substantive goals. He wants to be the Speaker of the House. And so that's how you that's how you swing all over the spectrum the way he has on Trump, sometimes like hour to hour. Now we'll see, it is one of our favorite authors, Robert Caro, says that power reveals, that you find out who someone really is when they get the power that they've wanted all along. And maybe when Kevin McCarthy is Speaker of the House, the mask will come off and it turns out that whatever, he knows that federal budget backwards and forwards, and he wants to figure out how to wring waste out of the system and then use that money to, I'm personally pretty skeptical of that proposition. But I think for the Republican Party as a whole, one of the reasons why it's so hard to answer your question is that so many of them have been in basically survival mode for the entirety of the Trump era, that they're just trying to stay one step ahead of the sort of cyberbully who runs their party. That there are fewer people in office on the Republican side who have really had the breathing room to do policy, with the exception of the Senate Republicans Jonathan's talking about.
And now we're going to move on to our speed round of questions. But as we do that, if anyone in the audience has questions, please do line up at the microphones on the first floor or in the loge boxes upstairs, and we will get to you soon. Remember to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what year you're in and who you are before moving on to your question. But as you line up for the lightning round, who was the most and least willing to speak with you for this book?
We can't fully answer that question for reasons of journalistic integrity. No, there were a lot of people who talked to us on the condition of anonymity, but there were a lot more who talked to us on the record, and we were thrilled with the reporting that we were able to do, and it was pretty wide ranging. I mean, one of the things that we really tried to do in this book is reach a range of sources from the highest levels of American politics, Donald Trump, Nancy Pelosi, to, frankly, people who were a couple of years out of college and who, were sort of pretty junior, but who had witnessed scenes and new information. And that's sort of the key to covering politics. You just have to cast the widest possible net.
What was the most surprising or salient piece of feedback you got from the book?
Feedback on the book or from within?
On the book.
Our parents loved it. That was good.
I would say that one thing that was a pleasant surprise to me, look, we've talked a lot about the Republicans and we've talked a lot about Trump. There is some real tough stuff in here about the Democratic Party and the experience of the Democratic Party and the Biden administration, the president, the vice president, and their relationship. And I think putting this together, one of our concerns was, is there going to be an audience that's willing to hear the negatives across the political environment, right? That's willing to hear that Donald Trump's a threat to American democracy, and also the Democrats have this other set of issues on their own. And I think I was really pleasantly surprised by the number of people who actually sought us out to say, boy, did you get my side right.
Yeah. Where did you spend most of your time while writing the book?
In an apartment in Manhattan with an infant.
Yeah, COVID times changed the nature of reporting of this book, for better and for worse. It changed it for better because we were able to do a lot of interviews where Alex was in New York, I was in Washington, and whoever we were interviewing was wherever they were. And time and space was accommodated because of the power of Zoom. And also, frankly, because we were able to get some reporting from people who were able to take notes or record meetings and Zoom conversations and phone calls that probably would have been in-person gatherings in the non-COVID era. I actually spent a lot of time during the reporting in the U.S. Capitol because the bureau of the New York Times was closed for basically the whole COVID period, and our condo in Washington is very small, and so I was in the Capitol in part just to have somewhere to work, but in part because when you're in the Capitol, as the senator knows, you see people and you pick stuff up just hour by hour because you just run into folks. You're walking around, and for those of you who haven't been there, the press basically has free run of the U.S. Capitol. And we can, outside the floor itself of the House and the Senate and the cloakrooms, we can basically go anywhere we want in the U.S. Capitol. And so you see lawmakers oftentimes without their staff, and you can just have candid conversations with them. So there were a number of things that we picked up, or at least tips or tidbits that we could track down just based upon being in the Capitol itself.
Perfect. All right, we'll turn it over to some of our student questions now. Start here in the bottom left.
Sure. My name is Jonah Simon. I'm a first year at the college studying government and also the associate U.S. editor at the HPR. And one of the things I wanted to ask was so a lot of Republican candidates for Congress and current members of Congress have proposed some pretty extreme acts of legislation or investigations if they were to take office. For example, a complete ban on abortion. Some have been calling for the impeachment of President Biden and other radical reforms. Could a Republican Congress under a Speaker McCarthy be the counterpoint that Biden might need in order to begin taking actual credit for his achievements or pushing up his approval ratings by utilizing that conflict?
Yes. No, I mean, there's no question that one of the things, we have this in the book, that sort of prominent Democrats outside the White House were sort of constantly pushing them on us. You gotta get out there and make the case that I am delivering for the American people, and the other guys are sucking up to Donald Trump. That they, what's the line? They love Donald Trump. They fear Donald Trump more than they want to help you, or something to that effect. And Biden has done that, but only really sporadically. And part of that is because of the pressures of wanting to do bipartisan legislation. You can't take a bat to the other guy if you're asking him to vote for your thing. But a lot of it's just that Biden himself is not really constituted that way. That's not his instinct. But look, we have seen president after president run against an unhinged opposition Congress, and often to significant effect. And particularly if the margin in the House is pretty small, the Freedom Caucus, the hard right flank of the Republican conference is going to have McCarthy by the neck. So he's going to have a really hard time holding back the sort of let's impeach every member of the Biden cabinet, let's impeach Biden, I think that some of the stuff like an abortion ban could be actually tougher for them even to get the votes for, and maybe there'd be more room for them just to simply not vote on that. But the specter of extreme legislation will be there as a pretty useful foil for Biden or whoever the Democratic nominee is in 24.
Hello, thank you for the optimism in the talk tonight. Jeb Ricketts, Master in Public Policy, Year 1. And a Raphael Warnock voter in 2020, and will do again in 2022. But I've heard from a lot of people in the state of Georgia about the future potential violence that may happen post-2022 midterm or in 2024 after a presidential election. Has anyone you ever spoken to considered widespread violence to be a possibility, especially if one side claims that an election is stolen a second time?
Yeah, no, it's one of the most sobering parts of this book, and certainly the experience of writing this book was coming to terms with the fact that we're not immune from the kind of political violence that has plagued other countries across the world. And obviously, look no further than January 6th. We did not have a peaceful transfer of power in this country. We just didn't, and that's hard to swallow, but it's the truth. And it's not gone away. I sort of fear it's only gotten worse. I worry that the 6th was not the culmination of events, but it was rather just sort of one more grim milestone on our sort of trend of normalizing political violence. A lot of members of Congress now have full-time security details that never had security details, and the reason they have that is because of the threats against them. And what's so worrisome about what Trump did in denying the election is he set the precedent for other people, and obviously mostly Republicans, but potentially some Democrats, to just not concede, to just not acknowledge reality, not come to terms with the fact that you lost an election. And that makes it easier for somebody to do that in a governor's race or a Senate race. And it only takes one crazy person to fire a gun, right? And then that radicalizes more people. And that's what really worries me, is not some mass sort of set two between the Warnock and the Walker forces rather after the election. Like there's going to be like some armed clash in Macon. What worries me is that there's like a protest, or that it gets out of control because somebody brings a gun and shoots people there, and then there's a response to that, and then we're spiraling. I think it's all too real of a possibility. Speaking of happy topics.
Do we have a question?
Oh.
Okay.
Hi. So Mark Lamont Hill and a colleague of his published a book called Except for Palestine, and sort of like framing US politics and US progressive politics as being limited by like the Palestinian exception. I'm from Johannesburg, South Africa, by the way, so I'm interested in, especially Mr. Burns, your perspective as a global affairs editor. What do you think, or in your coverage, why do you think that issue of Israel-Palestine has been particularly contentious? And do you think that amongst like the public there's a broader radicalization, and what would that mean for the US from a politics and a policy point of view?
Well, I want to be, I appreciate the question. I want to be sort of humble in how I respond to it, because I've actually not started my job as a global affairs editor yet.
Not global yet.
I'm very parochial still. Look, I think that you see the politics of Israel and Palestine changing, certainly on the left and in the Democratic Party. Some of it's along generational lines. I think the reality is that most American voters don't think a whole lot about the issue, right? And so the default position is support for Israel. The people who care the most about the issue in the country tend to be very supportive of Israel, and so they're the most motivated participants in the political system, and politicians respond to that. I'm not sure that that's as true today as it was 20 years ago. I'm not sure that it'll be as true 10 years from now, as it is today. But you actually see this on foreign policy on a number of fronts, and some of it, by the way, is driven by the sort of conduct of the Netanyahu government over the last decade, that a lot of Democrats, including Democrats in Washington, in elected office, who would never say this in public, see Netanyahu as having fully aligned himself with the Republican Party and sort of sacrificed or imperiled bipartisan support for Israel in the process. That's obviously not come to a breaking point. I'm not sure that it ever will come to a breaking point, but it's certainly more of a possibility today than it was when I became a reporter.
Great, we'll go to the bottom left again.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Greg. I'm a second year at the law school. And I think a lot of people believe that the forces that led Trump to being elected, whatever they may be, are not going away on their own. And my question is, do you think that in order for American democracy to be sustained, there will have to be at some point a transformative politics to transform either the political system or the economy of this country in a way that's at least as deep cutting as the New Deal? And if yes, then which do you think will come first, kind of political or an economic transformation? And if no, then kind of how do you think those forces will evaporate?
I tend to think the answer is probably no. I think it's really hard to see a transformational change on the political or economic level in a country that's so evenly divided. Look, I do think that you're going to see more frustration among Democrats about what they refer to as sort of minority rule, right? That you've got a Supreme Court, a Senate, and a presidential electoral system that does not reflect the will of the majority. And I think you're going to see more and more concerns about that. But there's just not the will right now, I don't think, for any kind of a large-scale reform. I think about the issue of expanding the Supreme Court, right, which became kind of a progressive, hot topic during the 2020 election. And, you know, Joe Biden created a Blue Ribbon Commission on that, and I think their report is somewhere in a circular file in Washington. That's a big thing to chew off, right? That's very difficult to do. And it's difficult enough when you've got FDR or LBJ size majorities. It's damn near impossible when the American government and the country is split like it is. And I would just say also, not to be totally cynical, but I think there's a lot of Americans who are just fine with the way things are. Maybe they have complaints or grumbles, but they're living their lives, man. And like, they're not thinking about, oh, we need a sort of new deal. They're thinking about, my kids got practice and recital tomorrow. How am I going to get there? And by the way, there's a pretty good game on tonight. I think I'll check that out. I mean, that's just, the reality of most Americans today,
We'll go bottom right over here.
Hi, I'm Madison Smither. I'm a first-year Master's in Public Policy student here at the Kennedy School and from New Orleans, Louisiana. Going off of the previous question, actually, about kind of a new deal, I guess what I would love to know is, given the Inflation Reduction Act and the climate crisis, which I guess, going off of what you all were saying about how most Americans are probably, content with how things are now, we've got to believe that with the climate crisis coming, I mean, this is sad to know, but things are going to get a lot harder, especially for a lot of residents in coastal communities. I know from Louisiana, we're starting to see climate action from both Democrats and Republicans, and in that complicated way in which it's starting to evolve. But do you see the Inflation Reduction Act and kind of clean energy as a potential breakthrough issue that could lead to more bipartisanship?
So I'm obsessed with this, like totally obsessed with this. Because I think as long as people think about climate policy as climate policy, there's going to be a limited reach to, who cares about it and who votes on it. I think when it starts to become, certainly in coastal areas, life or death, do you keep your house? And I think in a larger swath of the country, a sort of bread and butter economic issue, right? Where I just got a job at the battery factory, right? Or like I'm getting incredible business from the new Hyundai plant that's 2 counties over or whatever. Like, yeah, I think that does change the parameters of that issue. You already see it in a state like, where's the previous question, in Georgia, where Brian Kemp is not out there campaigning for a climate action and net zero and all that, but like, boy, does he love electric car factories, right? So I don't know that changes the balance of power in Washington. And I think that's one of the ways that it's challenging to think about politics, not in terms of sort of the balance between the parties, but when you think about the trend of issues, I think, yeah, that is an issue where you can see that becoming a sort of broader, subject for bipartisan action. I'm just not sure that, I think a lot of Democrats hope that like the country will swing in the direction of clean energy and the Democratic Party. And I think it is likelier that Republicans will sort of absorb some of those issues the way we have seen that happen with conservative parties in other countries where, it was Boris Johnson at the UN last year who said it actually is easy being green. I would not be surprised if you saw a Republican politician talk a little bit more like that in the next couple cycles.
Do one more right up there.
The sooner.
Hello, my name is James McCaffrey. I'm from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. And I was wondering, a lot of this book talks about the way that Trump has denied the election. But if we go back 4 years before that, there was a lot of talk over Russia's meddling in the election and a lot of controversy over that topic. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how that may relate and may have given a predisposition to go more extreme with that idea of rejecting the election results, and is there a possibility for more room to expand that idea in the Democratic Party with similar reasons?
Yeah, I think there is a tendency among Republicans who don't love Donald Trump, but who don't want to be on the defensive, the back foot, if you will, to, throw out things like, look, you guys believed in this Russia hoax for years and years, and that turned out to be not true at all. Or, look, you guys didn't accept the '04 election results. You're talking about machines in Ohio that were supposedly hacked. How can you, with clean hands, attack us on election denial? I mean, that's largely whataboutism. It just sort of gives an opportunity to, try to kind of deflect the charge. But I do think the larger issue here in the Trump era, it bred among the so-called resistance left this fantasy of the silver bullet is just waiting, and we're gonna uncover it here soon. And it was Russia, or it was Comey, or it was Maggie Haberman, our great colleague and friend, any day now is going to deliver the big story. And, after that, it's all going to be over, right? And it just became this delusion. Even friends and family I saw get, caught up in this, how soon is Comey going to be finished? Because once Comey's done, tell you what, that's going to be it. He's going to have to resign. And it just sort of built up and built up. And I think it also, the flip side of that was there became a Republican sense of, even those who didn't like Trump kind of grew weary of that and said, you're hounding the guy, you're trying to find this or that, but you're hurting your own cause, basically, by fixating on this stuff so much. And it created for Trump, I think, a force field, which he was able to sort of use to kind of, muddy the waters politically. And he's still doing that to this day, talking about the so-called Russia hoax and talking about, the FBI raid and how, other former presidents also took their papers too. And, that's not true, but he says it and puts it out there, and now his own party is conditioned to echo it or at least enable it.
Great. Thank you all so much.
Can we just grab the...
One more?
We have
Yeah.
one more question here.
Thank you for taking the question. I'm thinking back to when Biden chose Kamala Harris for vice president. There was an assumption perhaps that we were seeing the future of the party. He talked about himself as a transitional president.
The bridge.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
The bridge, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. The long
that,
bridge.
Kamala would be next, presumably. I feel like I haven't seen her since the inauguration. The only stories that I've seen about Kamala Harris are sort of these palace intrigue, problems with her staff. I'm curious kind of what happened with Kamala and Joe, and any speculation on where you think the Democrats will look next for leadership. Joe Biden turns 80 this week.
So I would strongly encourage you to turn your attention to Chapter 4 here. To be efficient about this, Kamala Harris, I think a lot of people, when she was chosen, including us, saw it as this is elevating someone who may well be the future of the party, and she may well be the future of the party. But the more we reported on that process, the more it was obvious that this was conceived at the time by the people who ran the process and the man who made the decision as a really short-term play, that they needed to get from August to November without blowing up an election that they were on track to win, and they saw her as the candidate who would do that. So on those terms, that's a successful selection. They won the election. Her addition to the ticket did not change the trajectory of the race at all. But unfortunately for her, her addition to the ticket also did not change the trajectory of the race at all. So you can't point to Kamala Harris joining the ticket and say, after that, Biden's support with women or with black voters or with Asian American voters spiked, and what a political success story. You just don't have that. And I do think that you see her limitations as a political figure in the midterm elections, that if you remember the 2010 midterms, the 2014 midterms, the 2018 midterms, Joe Biden's calling card was, I'm the guy who can go anywhere. That you may not like the president, you may not like Nancy Pelosi, but send me to any district in the country. He obviously can't say that anymore, but there's nobody actually in the administration of whom that is true, and certainly not the vice president. So if you're a Democrat who's looking at the president, looking at 2024 and saying, is this guy really going to do this again? I've just been struck, I think Jonathan probably has had the same experience. When Democrats talk about 2024, there's this like, well, Biden's very old, but if he doesn't run, then like, who do we even have? Well, you do have the vice president, right? But if that's the way Democrats are thinking and talking, that tells you something about sort of the state of that political project.
All right. Well, as we near the hour, thank you so much. Oh, one more?
No, I just had that's a great last question. Thank you so much.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Mr. Martin and Mr. Burns, for joining us today. And thank you to the audience for all of your great questions and your attention through the night. So we hope to see you again in forum, and have a great night ahead.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.